Using a 19mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove our lug nuts. Go ahead and set those aside. Remove the wheel, set that aside. Using a 21mm deep socket, we're going to go ahead and remove this nut, and we're going to hold the head of the bolt using an 18mm wrench. We're going to go ahead and remove our 2 bolts from our knuckle to the strut. I'm just going to go ahead and tap these bolts. Maybe we'll go ahead and use a pry bar here to try and work this around. Now that we have our wheel and now that we have our brake assembly with our knuckle separated from our strut, if you want to, you can go ahead and use a bungee cord or a strap. So we're going to go ahead and use our bungee cord here. We're going to hook it into the body here. We're going to stretch it around our caliper and into the rotor. And that's just going to support this here to keep this from pulling out and causing extra pressure on our hose. Using a 15mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove the 3 nuts on the top of our strut assembly. Do not touch the center nut here. I'm going to go ahead and remove these 3. Now we'll go to remove this 3rd one here. Once this nut comes off, the strut will drop out of here and come out through the wheel well. You either want to have an assistant to catch that, or when you're removing this, do it with one hand and then reach around through the wheel well and support that. Now at this point here, we want to go ahead and compress our coil springs so we can go ahead and disassemble our strut. You don't want to just do this in your driveway without having the tools to do the job. It is a major safety issue if you're starting to rip this apart without having the proper tools. We're going to go ahead and compress our spring. With our spring safely compressed, we'll go ahead and use our 21mm socket and remove the center nut. So at this point here, now that we have our center nut removed, I want to go ahead and hold that main strut assembly. You can work that down and out. Remove your upper bearing plate. Set that aside. Now if you receive a strut like this and it has a retaining rod on it, you can do a couple different things. Put the rod down on the ground, compress the strut, compress this by hand like so, remove the tension rod, and the strut rod will expand out to its full lock position. Once you have that retaining rod gone, remove the upper center nut and set that aside. You can take your bellows boot and your bumper, install it through the top. There's going to be a smooth section of a band here and a smaller tapered section at the bottom. And go ahead and push your bumper into the bellows. Next, take your bellows cap. And you're going to fit that right on like so. Once you have those 2 pieces assembled, take your strut, line this up, and push this down into place. Go ahead and make sure that your boot comes, or your bellows comes down over the top of the strut assembly, like so. Now on the base of our strut, we have our spring tray right here, and we have a spring isolator boot. We want to go ahead and swap this over onto our strut. Going to use our trim tool here. I'm going to go ahead and release this little locking button here. Pop that out. Remove the isolator. And we're just going to swap this over to the other strut. Take your isolator pad, slide it over. Good, line this up. Take your retainer clip and lock that into place. So on our upper bearing plate, it's specific on how you reassemble this here. Our bearing plate has the 2 holes behind our studs as our replacement part does here. It's critical because the bearing plate itself has an offset bushing on the bottom side here. So you can't just throw this on wherever you want it. So on our particular removal, our holes are facing outward. If you were to turn this, it would actually make the upper bearing plate crooked either way. So you want this to be nice and level. Go ahead and remove your upper unit here. Next is going to be the bushings. You want to pay specific attention to this here. As you can see, there's a natural resting spot for that coil spring for the tail end of the coil to fit into. I'm going to take our upper bushing, press it down into place. Take our upper bearing plate here. Get that in our position so that our 2 holes behind our studs are facing outward. Our lower spring bushing here, or isolator pad, has a mark, or has a spot right here where the tail end of the coil spring will line up to. Install the strut. Go ahead and push it up through our bearing plate. Line up the pigtail of our spring with the isolator here. Work that up into position. At that point there, you can go ahead and install the upper nut on the center of the strut. Go ahead and take your strut, push that up, push it through your upper bearing plate. Now on the bottom side, you want to make sure that the pigtail or the tail end of your coil spring fits right into the notch of the isolator pad here. On the top, you want to go ahead and put your cap on the center. Go ahead and install that nut. Once that nut is on there, I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down. Make sure that that tail part of the spring is still lined up with that pad. On the top section here, our upper plate has 2 holes in front of the studs. These are going to be mounted inward on the body, as well as the lower 2 bolts on the bottom. We want to go ahead and rotate that out. So at this point here, we can go ahead and rotate that this way here. We want these holes to be opposite of the stud mounts down below. Let's go ahead and release our spring. Now we went ahead and just tightened down this nut on the very top. It bottomed out for us. As we're releasing our spring, keep an eye on the spring in the isolator, make sure that lines up. Make sure that your spring on the top is lined up with our isolator on the top. Go ahead and lift your strut up into place, feed the nuts of the upper bearing plate up into the body, and then we'll reach up top and get the nuts caught to secure this in place. Now with the studs poking through, you can go ahead and capture one of those nuts there, just to hold it in place. And go ahead and rock that strut around Go ahead and capture the other two nuts here. All three nuts are caught. We're just going to go ahead and snug those down. The three upper nuts, we're going to go ahead and torque those down to 24 foot-pounds. Now that upper strut is installed, let's go ahead and take our knuckle, line this up. We got to release our bungee cord strap here supporting this. At this point, we want to go ahead and get our holes from our knuckle lined up with the strut itself. Let's go ahead and bonk this into place. In order to get our bolt started, I'm going to use a large screwdriver here. And we're going to use this to go ahead and line up our knuckle. Just so we can go ahead and get a bolt started in here. Once we get those bolts lined up, we'll go ahead and tap these in a little bit. Do the same for the bottom. And once we get these bolts in, we'll go ahead and get the nuts started. Yeah, let's go ahead and snug these nuts down. Now let's go ahead and torque these bolts down to 96 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and install our wheel. I'm going to start all of our lug nuts and get those threaded on by hand first. Once all these are on, we're going to go ahead and get those snugged down. And torque down our wheels to 100 foot-pounds. Now that we have your wheels torqued, you want to go ahead and bring your vehicle down to your local alignment shop and get that taken care of so you don't have premature tire wear.